Have you ever noticed that some of your houseplants in the autumn and winter change their leaf color? Now, it might not be an autumnal thing. It might be more to do with your care and also how the plant might react to the changing of the season. In this video, I want to dive into chlorophyll breakdown and what that might mean for our plants when they start losing some of their green. So stick around with me and let's dive into it. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. But before we dive into anything more specific, let's just do a bit of a refresher as to what chlorophyll is. Now, chlorophyll is what makes a lot of the plants that we have green. Think of it a bit like a pigment, even though it isn't, but it is what gives the plants their greenness, essentially. It plays a role in converting sunlight into something that is nourishing for the plants. It is something that gives the plants energy. And there are different kind of scientific proofs in terms of like the light and all these things, and that's why sometimes you get those pinky, purpley grow lights, is because they are excluding the hues that would be kind of replicating the green, because the theory behind it back then was the plant doesn't need that color because it's what color it reflects back from the chlorophyll in the plant. I think that has somehow been debunked recently because of the fact that we've got a lot more full spectrum grow lights these days, not just because they're much more visually appealing and we can have a standard light behind us when we've got in our kind of collections rather than a purple light, but there's also some value to the plants to provide them with that full spectrum of light. And chlorophyll is something that's particularly important to a lot of our houseplants, because if you think about it, houseplants, even though they are kind of understory jungle plants a lot of the time, so they don't get an awful lot of light, even having said that, a lot of the household conditions that we place them within tend to have relatively low light levels. So they need that green chlorophyll in order to be able to utilize as much of that light as they are getting available to them to create that energy for the plant itself. You might also notice that some of the plants that are kind of labeled as low light plants have got very deep leaves, almost a black color, but actually if you look at them up close, a lot of those black plants are actually just a very deep green, which generally means that the chlorophyll is highly dense and compact because it wants to have as much chlorophyll available in order to utilize those lower light levels, thus making it look a bit on the black side. Now let's have a look at how some seasonal triggers might affect kind of chlorophyll breakdown, and I've got an example to show you here, and this is a philodendron painted lady, a new painted lady, because my other painted lady, the very large one, has been gifted to a very dear friend. And part of the thing that we need to look at when it comes to these changes in the seasonality might be the lower light levels, the lower temperatures, the kind of irregularity of the water in relation to what it might have been during the growing season, where there's almost a situation in the summer, in the height of summer, in the height of the warmest months, that there is quite challenging for you to end up overwatering and rotting a plant out, because they tend to use up the moisture a lot faster in the winter because of those lower temperatures, because of that lower light level as well, and the lower total amount of hours of light. That's the other thing, because remember how much less light we get as a whole during the day in the winter is part of the reason why some of these plants might have chlorophyll breakdown. And sometimes when that chlorophyll breakdown, it's exposing other kind of elements, I think they are. So things like carotenoids and anthocyanins. Anthocyanins is something that a lot of people have spoken about before, and hopefully I will find a picture and add it here, because I don't have one at the moment, I think, that is exhibiting this. But anthocyanins is something that we see a lot of the times with some Hoyas, where if you put them in bright light, but not always the bright light, they will blush to a reddish, pinkish color. That's the anthocyanins. Hopefully the picture that I would have put here, if it's already happened, I'm not entirely sure, is actually not from a houseplant, but it's from one of the plants that I've got in my garden, which is the Traculospermum jasminoides, which does exhibit, it's kind of a plant that looks and smells a bit like a jasmine, but it isn't. The leaves are much more succulent, it's evergreen as well, but the interesting thing about that is that the leaves almost go entirely a maroon, reddy color for the majority of the winter, cold months, and then as soon as the summer comes along with the warmer months and the longer lights, the leaves all turn green again. So we're used to seeing the anthocyanins from like the point of maybe a succulent or even a Hoya, where they come about when there's too much light, but also it can work in the sense of that chlorophyll is kind of like diminishing on those leaves. For instance, the example of the plant that I was just talking about, and you see more of those anthocyanins. And then you've got carotenoids, I think, and that, if you kind of put the two together there, that's where you get some of the orange tones as well. If you think carrots, carotenoids, the orange comes from there, basically. The other thing we need to remember about the seasonal changes in the winter is, okay, fair enough, like the plants that we've got indoors don't get to experience the light levels fluctuating quite as much as the plants that we have outdoors, because obviously they're exposed to the much colder temperatures, the light levels kind of, it is what it is. You're not going to go outside and have a grow light on a plant. You might do, I don't know, I don't judge you, but most people wouldn't. But indoors you might have grow lights on, you might have kind of your regular household lights in, so the light level diminishing isn't quite as much on your house plants. However, things like watering irregularities, pulling back on some of the fertilizer, that could also cause some of these kind of chlorophyll issues. And the reason why I'm sitting here like showing you this plant and waving it around is because this is one that I bought recently, and you might be able to see, hopefully you might see some of the darker areas there. Can you see how many petioles are there on their own? And they don't have leaves anymore. All of these had leaves when I first got them. There we go. They're also coming off now. As I was saying this, because there's been some cold damage. This is a plant that I found in a supermarket, and they'd either, when I got it, it was bone dry, so they'd obviously underwatered it. They probably had it out in the freezing cold. That you can see a bit more of the cold damage there on that leaf as well. You can see some of the blackness and the darkness that's happening there. Is those cells within those leaves dying off as well, which also means that the chlorophyll is no longer there. So let's have a look at these things in more detail. So what we were talking about before, that these kind of causes, so watering irregularities, nutrient deficiencies or nutrient changes, light level changing, all of these things can contribute to the loss of chlorophyll. So let me give you an example of, and this is a Calathea yellow fusion. So I don't know whether or not you can see, these leaves are very, very almost blown out. There is some green, you can barely see this. You can kind of see the green a bit more on here, but if you look at a lot of these other leaves, they are changing. And this is exhibiting issues across the board. So lower light levels, lower temperatures, and lower nutrition, because obviously I am not fertilizing this plant in the slightest at the moment when it's barely got any green on the leaves. So that is something that you need to remember, that a lot of these factors are going to come into play when it comes to what you're seeing in your plants in terms of like the leaves changing color and losing some of that greenness. Because I mean, look at this plant, it's almost entirely yellow. Granted, some of this, so for instance this one here, that is predominantly variegation, but this plant, this leaf here was green. You can kind of see that, that's not variegation. That is the chlorophyll leaching out of this plant because of its environmental conditions. So when it comes to things like fertilizing, the reduction of fertilizing during the winter means there might be a lack of both nitrogen and magnesium, both of which are highly important to chlorophyll. And if the plant then no longer has that available to them on a regular basis, it makes for changes in its chlorophyll levels. So inadequate light, or even, so inadequate light, you'll probably just see your plants getting darker. And I can give you an example of that here. I have got a croton. I know there's a lot of people twitching in the background there. So these two leaves here, the highly colourful ones, are from the summer where there was a lot of light. If you see some of these more green leaves, that was from last winter. Yes, this grows exceptionally slowly, but I'm okay with it because it's still surviving, it's fine. But that might give you an indication of, when we're talking about the carotenoids and the anthocyanins, in this plant, they become more prevalent in the lighter months of the summer and the warmer summer months. But then you can see that the plant is not going to mess around with losing some of that chlorophyll. It's going to put as much chlorophyll as possible during the lower light months, like winter. How about everybody's favorite, watering issues, especially in the winter? Can you see the yellowing that is happening on that one of those lowest leaves on the Monstera obliqua Peru here? That almost entirely happened when the season changed, and I kind of was still trying to water it to the summer and spring levels, when really this needs it to move over to kind of more autumn and winter frequency of watering, which means I have caused an issue here on this leaf, and you might be seeing this on some of your leaves as well. Hopefully it's on the lowest leaves, because we've talked about this on other videos. The plant is sacrificing those older leaves in response to being able to keep the newest leaves happy and healthy. That's the newest leaf there. I don't want to touch them too much because they are super fragile. I've already ripped this one, and they're super soft. But that is another way that you can see a loss of chlorophyll because of overwatering. Right. Because I can't lift up the plant and show you, this was one of its lowest leaves and it was kind of dying off anyway. So I thought I'd bring it up so you can show you. This is a leaf that's losing its chlorophyll, but not because of anything else, but this is because of too much light. So this plant, this is from a variegated Burle Marx philodendron, is way too close to a grow light, or at least this leaf was. So then you get that bleaching of the leaves, which essentially what does it mean? It means that the chlorophyll is kind of vacating the premises, and then you get patterning like that. And bleaching from the sun can have very many different forms. It can even come across as a bit of a burn on the plant or a crisping on the plant, but this is usually the first early signs that you'll see that your plant is maybe getting a bit too much of a grow light. Move that grow light back. And then you've got aging of the leaves. So this is an example, again, I'm using the example of my Epipremnum skeleton key. This is one of its oldest leaves, and it's yellowing off to kind of die off and give space for some of its newest leaves, as I've mentioned earlier on. But this is part of a natural phenomenon, which means that that chlorophyll is kind of vacating the premises because this leaf is about to die off. So what are some of the practical implications of all of the things we've just discussed now? Let's look at them one at a time. So light and light adjustment. We're all a lot more aware that winter months is darker, so we start blasting all of our plants. Hopefully you're picking up a grow light somewhere from some direction, because there are multiples going in my space at the moment. So we start blasting all of our plants with grow lights, thinking, you know what, let's give it the majority of light that it can possibly get. Now, yes, that is a good thing, but it could also be a bad thing if you're not quite sure what you're doing yet. By and large, and I hesitate to say this, you won't kill your plants by giving them too much light, but you will probably stress your plants out, and I have done a video about plant stress and I'll link it at the top there. So that is something that you need to remember. So two things about artificial light, or about the lack of light in the winter, and about that kind of loss of chlorophyll. What you don't want to do is cause a situation like this leaf here, where you're giving the plant too much light. So if this is happening, move your grow lights further back, or if they've got a dial and a dimmer, dim them down a bit. You're giving your plant too much light. Now, the other question that a lot of people always have when it comes to light is, but I don't know how long do I need to put it on for? Is it just supplementing light? So yes, if you are just supplementing light and your plants are near a window and they're going to get light anyway, in theory, the only time you should be switching on your grow lights is during those nighttime periods where it is dark. and it's not getting the light from there, and then you're basically topping up those light levels that it's not getting through the rest of the day that it might have done in the summer months. Now, if your grow light is too close, obviously you might need to move that back. If your grow light is too far away, it might still not be getting any of the benefit of that grow light. You then need to move that a bit closer or dial it up. So there's all these fine adjustments that you can do. That's when it comes to grow lights. If you don't have grow lights or you don't want to use grow lights, it's utilizing the windows that you've got in your space. So something that might have been okay in maybe a north-facing window in the summer because it's not getting a huge level of light, but it's getting just about enough that it's surviving, it really will not be happy with that same light level in the winter. It will probably need a bit more because the intensity of the light or the hours that that plant is seeing the light is not enough. So moving some of your plants around to somehow more bright and light locations in your house will definitely help. Now, we've said this before, especially when it comes to fertilizer. There's a reason why I still fertilize even very, very weakly with my plants, even in the winter months, is because you are still providing them with that nitrogen. I've done a whole video again on terrestrial and epiphytic plants. So epiphytic plants, if they lose a bit of that nutrition, that shouldn't be too much of an issue in the winter. Your terrestrial plants that are used to being at a buffet of nutrients being within their soil all the time, regardless of the time of the year, especially if the plant is still actively growing, and you hear people saying this, is your plant still producing leaves, then yes, you should still at least give it some notion of a fertilizer, just because the moment that you stop, it's going with whatever's left in its soil level. And if its soil level is depleted of nitrogen 3-4 months before the end of the winter and before you start refertilizing again, this plant is going to struggle. You're going to start losing some of the greenness because the nitrogen that's needed there potentially for the plant isn't going to be there to help support that chlorophyll creation. Now, watering is another big one. You need to be adjusting. So this plant in this croton, specifically in the summer, gets watered every 3 or 4 days because it will use up the water really, really quickly. The crotons I also found indoors tend to be on the thirstier side most of the time. However, in the winter, even things like your ferns, who have had lower light levels, and you might still be drowning them in water because ferns like to be moist all the time, you're still drowning them, and it still might be causing some rot issues. It might be causing that chlorophyll to leach out because there's that inconsistency within your watering, that the watering is more than what the plant needs, essentially. Make sense? So coming into some final thoughts for this video, you need to remember you're going to lose some of that chlorophyll, and it might not just be because, you know what, it's fall or it's autumn and the leaves are changing colour like they would do outside. Most of these plants aren't meant to do that. Most of our house plants are not meant to do that. I know I'm preaching to the choir. Most of you already know this. For the people that don't, FYI, plants, majority of the things that we will have indoors as houseplants, not all of them, are not deciduous. So they won't change their leaf colour and drop all their leaves because the seasons are changing. Because again, the seasonal change that most of our houseplants might be experiencing in a household condition isn't anywhere near as drastic as what they might be experiencing outdoors. So that's one thing to remember. But then you also need to remember that chlorophyll is a living part of these plants, and it will react to not just environmental things, like we talked about the water, the lighting, the temperature, the nutrition, all of these things, but it will also react to the lack of them or the inconsistency of them as well. So if there is that lack or there is that inconsistency, you'll get kind of more bleached out leaves, or you'll get the greener leaves, and you won't get as much of the anthocyanins and the carotenoids, which will give you some of the nice coloration that you like on the leaves. So for example, with a croton, if you want to keep the light going, step ahead of myself there. If you want to keep some of the colouring going, give it more light in the winter and make sure that everything else is staying consistent to trick the plant essentially into thinking that it's still the growing season. And then also being aware of temperature changes, because if you're starting to get like cold damage on your plant, you might need to move it somewhere a bit warmer because barring just the fact that you're losing chlorophyll, which is going to cause an issue, and you start losing petioles and you start losing leaves, you'll have an issue with your plant eventually that you're going to need to address. So making sure that you're making these adjustments in order to make sure that the chlorophyll levels within your plant are as optimum as they can possibly be. That means you're going to have lusher, fuller, greener leaves, even more so, and I haven't even touched on variegated plants, even more important when it comes to plants that are variegated, because remember with a variegated plant, let me pick up one to show you. So this is a Calathea white fusion, I think, that is doing okay in the winter, but you can see all of those white sections, they cannot photosynthesize. They do not have any chlorophyll like from their nature as well. So what you need to be aware of is that this plant specifically is going to need further adjustment than even just a green plant, because it's less adept out of the box to be able to utilize the green and the chlorophyll within its leaves in order to photosynthesize. I think that's everything I wanted to touch on a bit on kind of like changes within the chlorophyll of your plants during the autumn and winter months. And as I said, I did touch on the fact that sometimes this will change in the spring and summer as well, where you might get more of those anthocyanins and the carotenoids coming out. Same thing might happen in the winter, but for different reasons. But yes, was this something that some of you might have been aware of, something that you might have learned that might be new? Let me know down below in the comments and let's have that conversations. Are you seeing any of these signs in your plants at the moment? Let's have that chat down below, because there's a lot of people, not just me, but a lot of you, my audience is highly knowledgeable, and I know there's also some people that are just starting off in their journey, and I do love the fact that you all help each other so much in the comments. So yes, let's have that conversation down below. Hopefully you've enjoyed, hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, bye.